Hi everyone and welcome to a new video. In this one I'll go through how I made my black corset style top for my Briar Rose costume. If you follow me on Instagram, you would have seen in my stories quite a few months ago that I made this corset dress, and I actually made it in anticipation of using it for my Midnight Masquerade Aurora dress. But I ended up not liking it, and instead of throwing it away, I thought it would be perfect to repurpose into my Briar Rose costume. So I won't go through how I made this corset dress because it's basically the same as how I make all my corsets. I'll link my other videos of how I make my corsets in the description box below. The only difference between this corset dress and my other corset, my other corsets I guess, is that this is a single layer of fabric rather than 2 layers of fabric, which is what I usually do. So that's the only difference. Other than that, construction is basically the same. Anyway, I will move on to what I am doing in the video clips and we'll get right into how I made the corset top. So as you would have seen, I chopped off the top edge of the corset dress so I can remove all of the boning. So that's what I'm doing here, and there you can see all of the boning that came out of the dress. The black is the cable ties that I used as well, so it's a bit of a mix between the synthetic plastic boning and then cable ties. I also cut down the center back and the center front of the dress, and that would obviously give me 2 halves to the dress. So here is 1 half, and then what I did was I marked with blue chalk the bottom edge of where I want this corset top to be. Then I cut out along the chalk marking line to give me 1 half of my bodice. I repeated this for the other side of the dress, and I just used the piece that I just cut out as a template for this. Next up, I wanted to extend the width of my bodice, so to do that I used this extra bit of fabric. It's just a small rectangle, and I pinned it to the I think I pinned it to where the eyelets are. Yes, so I pinned it to the center back, or what used to be the center back, to fill in that gap. So traditionally this corset dress, top, whatever you want to call it, would have a 2-inch gap in the back, and because I no longer want that, I'm just closing that up with this rectangle piece of fabric. And I'm just sewing that down, and I'm not worrying about raw edges or anything like that. I just want to literally fill in that 2-inch gap. One thing I did do is I sewed down multiple lines or multiple rows of stitching along the eyelet parts of the dress, and this is because I wanted to make sure that this panel was extra secure in the back of the bodice. I did not want to risk it shifting or coming out of place. There will be quite a bit of tension pulled on it, so that is the reasoning behind me wanting to put as many stitches as possible through the center back. The next thing I went on and did was mark the center front. It's not exactly the center, but it's the front opening of the bodice, and I wanted it to be this slanted V shape almost, and so I just roughly drew that with chalk. Again, used that part that I just cut out as a template to cut out the other side of the corset top. So now this is what I've got. It's basically the base of the corset top. It's all cotton, and what I am going to mold on top of it is the satin, the black satin layer. Since the black satin layer is quite flimsy, it does need something to adhere to almost, otherwise known as interlining. So to create the interlining, I'm actually cutting out some more of the cotton fabric, and I'm just using the remaining skirt parts of what originally was the corset dress to do this, and I'm using the corset top to trace out some rough pieces of what I want my black satin layer, what I want those pieces to be. So here's the black satin, at least I think it's satin. If it's not, please let me know in the comments. Thank you to my friend who lent me this fabric, or let me use this fabric. This was actually from her Maleficent costume, so she had some scraps left over and I needed some black fabric, so yeah. So now what I'm doing is cutting out those bodice pieces, and I'm using the cotton layers that I just cut out as the templates to cut my satin layers out of. So like I said, the cotton layer will be the interlining for the black satin layer, just so the black satin doesn't warp too much and actually has some substance to it. Next up, I am ironing all of the bodice pieces, and I'm just taking out the pins and ironing all 4 layers together. So there's 2 layers of the cotton and then 2 layers of the black satin fabric. So once I've done all of that, this is what I've got, and I'm going to start laying the cotton and the black satin layers together, wrong sides together, and this is how I am going to interline these pieces. So I'm continuing to do that for all of my bodice pieces. You can see that large square in the middle is my back piece, and then I've got smaller pieces as we progress around to the front of the bodice. So here's what we've got, and you can see that each of the black satin layers has a cotton layer backing. Now if I was a good seamstress, I would use, what's it called? I forget the term, but essentially hand basting all of these layers together before I actually sew my seams. But because I'm lazy and I was doing this project in a rush, I just went ahead and started pinning where I want my seams to be sewn. So here you can see that I've got the next panel pieces attached to the back panel piece of my corset top, and I'm just sewing the seams as you do. And I'm really making sure that the cotton layer does not shift too much. That's the purpose of having basting stitching, but obviously I did not do that. So I'm continuing to do the whole process of sewing the side seams. I'm calling them side seams, but they're all of the seams of the bodice, and treating the cotton layer with the satin layer as one. So now that all of the bodice pieces have been sewn together, I'm going ahead and ironing all of the seam allowances open flat. So essentially ironing down on the satin layer, and that will open up all of the seam allowances nice and flat. So now what I'm doing is pinning the facing of the front edge of the bodice. So this is just a scrap rectangle piece that I've cut a few inches wide, and I am pinning that the same way that I pinned all of the seams of the bodice. So putting the bodice aside, keep in mind I did not sew those facing panels down, they're just pinned for now. I'm moving on to sewing this ribbon lengthways? Down the length of the ribbon, so it's half the width essentially, and these are going to form the little loops that I'm going to insert into the facing panel. You'll see what I mean in a few minutes. Anyway, with the ribbon I am creating these little loops by folding it about an inch, and here we go, back to the facing panel. I am inserting the little loop and sandwiching it in between the two layers of fabric and then pinning the loop down. So there you can see the ribbon has formed a little loop, and that's inserted in between the two layers of the bodice, and I'm going to continue doing that for the whole length of the bodice, so creating little loops out of the ribbon, putting the little loops into sandwiching it in between the two layers of fabric and pinning it down. So my loops, I just eyeballed them, so I'm not sure how far apart they are, but they are very close together, and in the end I really did not need to do that, because when I do lace up this top I skip every second loop, so essentially every second loop doesn't get used. So yeah, and this is just pinned for the moment, but you can sort of see how it's going to turn out in the end. Okay, so time to sew this all down. Because each of the loops is going to take a bit of strain when it's all laced up, I backstitched over every single loop, as you see here. So every loop, backstitch it, and it should be extra secure and strong. So here's a close-up of what my stitching looks like. You can see there's quite a few back stitches going on, and here's what the loops look like from the outside, from the right side. So I think this is pretty neat, and it beats having to put eyelets into this type of fabric. Now what I am demonstrating, what I'm going to sew here, is I'm going to sew down along each of the seam allowances, so top stitching each of the seam allowances down so they all lie nice and flat and they don't come out of place or start folding in weird directions. So I'm top stitching along each of the seams, and I'm doing it either side of the seam as well. So that's really making sure that those seam allowances don't move. Okay, moving on. So now I am trimming off the excess seam allowance along each of those seams that I had just sewn, or at least the top stitching that I had just sewn for each of those bodice seams. And this is just to help clear away any of the bulk of the fabric. After that's done, this is what we're working with so far. You can see that the front edge of the bodice now needs top stitching, and the way that I am doing this is top stitching so that the seam allowance as well as the loose ends of the little ribbon loops are all sewn down in that one seam, essentially. Hopefully that makes sense. I think you can get a better idea of what I'm doing just by watching the video clips. So once all of that has been top stitched down, I am then going to attach the fashion layer of the bodice to the base layer. So if you recall back to the very beginning of this video, I did cut out the base layer out of the cotton from the corset dress, and that's what I'm using as the base of this bodice. And then the fashion layer, which is the black satin fabric with its cotton interlining, that's the outer layer, which is going to be seen from the outside. So the way I'm pinning these two together is by lying right sides together and then pinning down the front edges of the bodice. And as you can see here, there's quite a bit of excess fabric in the back of the fashion layer compared to the base layer. So all I'm doing is just pinning that like that, and then I'm going to move on to actually sewing these two layers together. So sewing along the center front, or the front edges of the bodice, like so, and you can see that I didn't actually follow the edge of the fabric because it was all cut crookedly and not the shape that I wanted, so I just followed my own line from my head of where I want to sew these two pieces together. So here you can see a close-up of where they've been sewn together, and I made sure to do extra stitching, like back stitching along the waistline, since that's where a lot of tension will be when this is worn. Now what I am doing is pinning together the rest of the bodice at all of the seam lines. I'm not actually going to sew this down, I'm just doing this working my way from the front edges of the bodice towards the center back, because I need to make sure that I get rid of any of the lumpy bumpiness of the fashion layer on top of the base layer, so I can work out exactly where I need the center back of the fashion layer to be pinned and sewn down. So that's the purpose of me pinning down all of these along all of the seams, just so I can work out how the back panel is going to be. So here I've now worked out the placement of the seam for the center back of the fashion layer, and I've got all of that pinned in place, so now I can take out all of the other pins that I had put in just before for each of those seam lines. So taking out all of those pins except for the ones that are currently within the center back of the bodice. So now the center back bodice can be sewn like so. So I'm closing that up so that way the fashion layer is the exact same width measurements, whatever you want to call it, as the base layer, and with the excess fabric, rather than chopping it off, I'm just pinning it down like that, so squashing it flat and then pinning all across, and then I'm just going to sew a few stitches over this, and this is going to form extra top stitching and a bit more stability in the back of the bodice rather than just the one seam. I ended up flipping to the right side of the bodice and pinning from that side, because when I go to sew this center back seam, I'm going to be doing it from the right side facing up, so like you see here, and this is just so I know how the stitching will look from the outside, just to make sure it looks relatively neat. It's not perfect, but I wasn't intending it being perfect since it was such a rushed job. So once I had the initial top stitching done, I went ahead and flipped it to the inside layer, and this is because I just need to see exactly where I'm sewing to make sure that I'm not sewing on the folded part of the cotton layer. I hope you get what I mean by just watching the video clip. Okay, so now all of those rows of stitching have been done, and this is how the center back of the bodice looks from the outside. And like I said, it just provides more stability to the back of the bodice. The next thing I am doing is trimming off the excess fabric along those front edges of the bodice. So trim that off, and then I can work on flipping the bodice to the right sides facing outwards. That's what I'm doing here, and you can see that the edges now have a nice finish, and I just need to top stitch those down so the lining layer of the bodice doesn't peek through. So I'm doing that now, and yeah, that's basically it. And I'm pinning in the black satin part of the bodice that is just underneath those ribbon loops. And so that's what that looks like. And then I can go ahead and top stitch this down, and I'm making sure to move the ribbon loops out of the way, so I'm only catching the black satin and the cotton layer underneath. Now I can go and insert the boning back in, and here I'm just working out where I want the boning to be. I've got the boning positioned at those placements of where they originally were in the original corset dress. As for the centre back, I'm only placing a few bones there since there's already so much stitching going on there, which already provides a bit more support. Anyway, so now I can take out those bones and I can work on actually sewing the boning channels closed, and I'm working along the top edge of the bodice first, so pinning that all down and making sure that's all nice and flat and straight, and then cutting off the excess fabric that peeks over the fashion layer. So there were some places where the cotton layer actually was larger than the fashion fabric. And then I am sewing all along the top edge of the bodice, and this will close off the boning channels. At each of the boning channels I'm making sure to do some back stitches just to make sure that the boning won't poke through the stitching. And now with the boning, obviously I need to shorten it because it was much longer when it was in the corset dress, and now for the corset top bodice thing, the bones need to be shortened. So I'm just cutting those bones and rounding out the edges as much as I can with my scissors. I know that you can use sandpaper to file down the edges so they're not pointy or sharp, but I don't have sandpaper, and at least at this place where I was making this I didn't have sandpaper, and also I'm lazy. So once all of the bones have been popped in, I can go ahead and pin where I want the boning channels to be closed off, and yeah, it's basically self-explanatory from here on out. Same sort of thing as before, where I close off the boning channels by sewing all across the bottom edge of the bodice. And once that's done, I can trim off the excess fabric, so you can see that the base layer is actually quite a bit shorter than the fashion layer, so I'm just trimming off the excess fashion fabric. Moving on to the binding for the bottom edge and top edge of the bodice, I'm cutting out a long strip of fabric from the cotton, not the cotton, the black sateen. That's the first time I've said sateen, the satin layer. So I've cut out a very long strip, ironed that so it wasn't so wrinkly, and then I'm pinning that to the edge of the bodice, like so, and then sewing that down. And I'm doing that for both the top and bottom edge of the bodice. Now I'm just trimming down the seam allowance, just so when I turn over the binding it won't have too much bulk to go over and cover. I'm also trimming down my binding because I found that this strip of fabric was a bit too wide for my liking. Once I've trimmed down the binding, I can fold it in half and then fold it again so it covers the raw edge, and then pin this in place and then essentially top stitch all the way down along that binding. And here's what I did for the front edge of the bodice, where it has that weird corner piece. I'm just folding the fabric in any way that I can to get it to look reasonably nice. So here's what the whole bottom edge looks like when pinned down, and up here is the top edge. And from the inside you can see that it doesn't look that great, but it does cover up the raw edge, which is what I'm after. So top stitching all of the binding down across the bottom and top edge of the bodice. I did have to leave the very front edges of the bodice just pinned in place. I couldn't actually sew them since they were very, very bulky, and I would have more control if I did these by hand. But for all the rest of the bodice I was able to do by machine, I did. So here you can see that the front edge corners of both the top and bottom of the bodice are still yet to be sewn down, but the rest of it is all nicely top stitched down and there are no raw edges, which is great. So the way that I sewed those corner pieces closed is by using a double threaded needle and doing some small whip stitches, so capturing a bit of the fabric underneath and poking through to the binding on the top. And so just repeat this until that whole edge is nice and secure. So this is basically the last step for the main portion of the bodice, but I still do need to make the modesty panel for the bodice, and I will show that in my next video. So here's a sneak peek of the modesty panel, which will lie in between the two front edges of the bodice, like that. But that's for the next video, so stay tuned for that. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, and if you want to see more of my stuff, you can follow me on Instagram. I have YouTube, Instagram, oh, and there's also my website if you want patterns. I also have some patterns available up on my website. I'll leave all links in the description box below, but until next time, stay creative.